not to break off anything percolating there, but there's something here on the objective good for the person that I'd like to add to all that has been said so far. And here I turn to von Hildebrand's treatise on the nature of love, where he adds something not found in the ethics, which shows the importance for him of this objective good for the person. Now, this is from chapter 9 with the title Eigenleben. I translated that as subjectivity and transcendence, and this is said with respect to love. Now, Eigenleben means something like concern with one's own life and one's own good. And transcendence is this affirmation of the beloved for their own sakes. Now, what is remarkable here and goes beyond all previous writings of von Hildebrand is the, you might say, the dignity that he sees in the objective good for the person. It's an important supplement to what you've read in the ethics, and it may clear away some difficulties that you've been feeling. So he speaks of the subjectivity of the one who loves like this. The defining trait of subjectivity is the realm of all those things that are of concern to me as this unrepeatable individual, that stand in some relation to my happiness, that address me. This in contrast to all that belongs to the subjectivity of another person whom I don't know. So there's this Eigenleben, or subjectivity, which is, you might say, that center in which things beneficial for us address us and appeal to us. And he makes a great point of the fact that in love it is in no way an ideal that I suppress this concern with my own happiness, or as it were suppress my own Eigenleben. And there comes here a passage where on 206, which seems to me to have great importance, where he contrasts our relation to value in value response, where we transcend ourselves and venerate some good for its own sake. That had been a great theme in the ethics. But then he brings in a different dimension of the person that is, as it were, achieved in the Eigenleben, or this subjectivity of the one who loves. So let me just read a few sentences, and the drift of it is this, that he wants to show that there is a certain kind of altruism that says, my happiness doesn't count, it's all about the beloved person. And he thinks that altruism is perverse. And one of the main things he wants to do in this book is defeat that altruism. So it's not just an excessive focus on one's own happiness and instrumentalizing others for one's happiness, which he had opposed in the ethics, but also a depreciation of one's self, one's subjectivity, in favor of the beloved person, as if there was some residue of selfishness, when I'm concerned about my own flourishing in the relation of love. And so he says, and this recapitulates what he had said in the ethics, whoever does not acknowledge the transcendence of human beings, as in value response, fails to understand what distinguishes them as persons from all impersonal creatures. But, whoever smells something egocentric in the fact that I desire an objective good for myself, whoever thinks that the ideal of human life is for me to lose all interest in beneficial goods, for myself, fails to understand the character of man as subject. He fails to see the mysterious center to which everything in the life of a person is referred, the center that is addressed by beneficial goods, and that is inseparably bound up with his dignity as person. If the first error, denying the transcendence, locks persons in themselves and in this way distorts their ultimate relation to the world and to God, the second error, the depreciation of Eigenleben, deprives them of their character as full selves. The first error reduces man to the biological, taking him according to the model of a plant or animal. The second error robs him of his character as a full subject and destroys the personal in him by exaggerating the objective to the point of dissolving that which makes him a subject. So there is, you might say, a very worrisome depersonalization that enters into our thinking. He's writing here about love when one stresses the other to the point of depreciating one's own happiness in loving. And the idea is not at all that, that nobody can be completely generous. We've got to make a few concessions in the end to our own selfishness and therefore look out for our own happiness. It's not the idea at all. The idea is rather that you somehow abandon yourself as personal subject by losing all interest in what is beneficially good for you, and taking it as an ideal always just to live the self-transcendence of value response. So it's as if there's a whole dimension of the person that comes out only when the person is really concerned for his or her own well-being and happiness. That idea of a certain compromising of man as personal subject by losing that, by discrediting that concern with one's own well-being, that I think throws more light than we get in the ethics on the significance of this third category of importance, and how it's indispensable that you do violence to the person if you try to live by value response alone, as if that were the only alternative to the importance of the subjectively satisfying. So I wanted to add that so you could say von Hildebrand understands himself on the one hand, as a critic of the so-called eudaimonism that makes one's own happiness somehow the main point of all love relations, almost to the point of instrumentalizing the beloved person for my happiness. That he thinks is, a serious disorder of the person. But in a way, the opposite altruistic depreciation of the good of the one who loves is just as destructive of the person, he wants to say. And so the way he deals with these opposite errors of what he calls eudaimonism and altruism is a very interesting feature. But what mainly concerns me here is the interesting use made of the third category of importance. So that's chapter 9 in the nature of love, if that is of interest to you. Yeah, that's brings us almost to the end of the three categories of importance and their interrelations. Now, we should say something about direct and indirect importance, which is a distinction made at the end of chapter 3. And basically, it's a distinction between willing something for its own sake and willing something as a means to something else. So you have direct importance when something is willed for its own sake, and indirect importance when something is indeed willed, but not for its own sake, but for what will result from it. And Van Hildebrand wants to say that distinction isn't as important as you might think. It does not give any new category of importance. He thinks the distinction, that's of course very interesting in its own right, between direct and indirect importance is not a categorical distinction. It's rather a distinction that can be found within all three categories. So something of value can be willed for itself, but I can will something instrumentally for the promotion of some value. Or something beneficially good can be willed for its own sake, or I can will something as leading to a beneficial good. And then you have indirect importance of the third category. Even things merely subjectively satisfying can be willed for their own sakes. You know, there's a sense in which the smoker who lights up again, getting subjective satisfaction, doesn't want that as instrumental to anything else, but in a sense for its own sake. But again, something like a painful medicine, would be indirect importance, instrumental with a view to the result. And so he makes the interesting claim there that direct and indirect importance is a distinction about how importance adheres to the bearer of importance, whether it adheres directly or indirectly. But it doesn't cut importance precisely and give us a distinct category of importance. And so he says if we're told this is desired not just instrumentally, but for its own sake, we know as yet very little about the nature of that motivation, because we don't know which of the three categories of importance the direct importance is found in. So it's one of his objections to G.E. Moore that Moore thinks this is the big distinction to make within good, the for its own sake and the instrumental good. And Van Hildebrand, it can easily seem as if, you want it for its own sake, that's surely value. But he claims that it really could be in any of the three categories of importance and still be sought for its own sake. And therefore, it's not another name for value. And has its legitimacy in a theory of good and value, but he thinks it's quite subordinate in importance to the categorical distinctions that he tries to make in the in chapter 3. Now, if you don't stop me, I thought I would just make a few brief comments about chapter 6, entitled The Role of Value in Man's Life. This may be the last act of today's meeting, these few remarks on chapter 6. I see Van Hildebrand here arguing that, in effect, value is not something that every now and then crops up, but that the world is saturated with value. I've often thought that we could appropriate to Van Hildebrand the famous statement of Thales, the world is full of gods, and say the world is full of values. And that, you might say, abundance of value, not a rare and occasional phenomenon, but something woven into the web of the world in many, many places. That I see is the idea of chapter 6. And he puts it like this, that we constantly presuppose value, that if we praise someone, we honor, we admire, we venerate someone, in all those cases we are recognizing value in the other. Or if we insist on the truth and make a point of telling the truth, or resent it when somebody tries to deceive us, we're acknowledging the value of truth. And it's an interesting thought that you don't have to go ferret value out of a few hiding places, but that it's really everywhere. You just have to be sensitized to it. That I see as the interesting claim of chapter 6. And as an example of this abundant givenness of value, I wanted to look at a passage that Dr. Sanford gave us. I must admit I had never before read it, from The Parts of Animals, that chapter 5, I think, in book 1. And what jumped out at me as I read through that chapter 5, I don't know if this is what you were wanting me to get from this text, but what I did in fact get were an abundance of allusions to, or an abundance of places where Aristotle presupposes value in the Hildebrandian sense. He doesn't thematize it, but he presupposes it. And so let me just read this from the beginning of chapter 5. Of things constituted by nature, some are ungenerated, imperishable, and eternal, while others are subject to generation and decay. No mention of value yet, but watch what comes. The former are excellent beyond compare and divine, though less accessible to knowledge. That talk of excellent beyond compare is nothing other than the language of value, the intrinsic worth or excellence of these ungenerated, imperishable things. And then he proceeds to speak of perishable things which are closer at hand, and says, we must not recoil with childish aversion from the examination of the humbler animals. Every realm of nature is marvelous. And as Heraclitus, when the strangers who came to visit him found him warming himself at the furnace in the kitchen and hesitated to go in, is reported to have bidden them not to be afraid to enter, as even in that kitchen divinities were present. Well, so we should venture on the study of every kind of animal without distaste, for each and all will reveal to us something natural and beautiful, especially that talk of the beautiful is a way of speaking of value. You even have Van Hildebrandian value hierarchy here, with the imperishable things ranking higher than the perishable. When he speaks of some being ignoble, he means, I think, more limited in beauty, and yet, after all, having a beauty of their own. So it seemed to me that the passage contrasts the perishable and the imperishable very much in a value vein, and gives evidence of what Van Hildebrand means in saying that value is not a rare and hidden thing, but given everywhere. One just has to know how to look for it and to recognize it. Even in the most rigorous value subjectivist, you just have to put your ear to the ground for a minute and you can discern various values. Hildebrandian values recognized by the subjectivist. I like, when I study value subjectivism with my students, to take the text of J.L. Mackie, this Australian philosopher whose little work, Ethics, subtitle Inventing Right and Wrong, in the first chapter gives the most acute and intelligent exposition of value subjectivism I know. He's an extremely intelligent subjectivist who thinks his position through with great precision. But Mackie, acknowledges the value, let's say, of truth. If I were to write a review of his book and misquote him and ascribe things to him that he never said, he would resent it and protest and be indignant at that kind of treatment, showing that he's still, for all of his subjectivism, alive to the value of truth and truthfulness, and knows how to demand it of his readers. That idea of Van Hildebrand, let's put it like this, and he says this in chapter 6, that if you bracketed out really all value that's anyhow given in experience, the world would be unrecognizable and it would be unbearable. So fundamental is value, the world of values, to the constitution of being. That's worth thinking through, that fiction of a world stripped down of every value, reduced to nothing but neutral forces and things, devoid of all value, having no importance except that of the merely subjectively satisfying. And then there's one final point in this chapter 6 I would commend to you. He says, when I say that value is presupposed everywhere, and that the world is full of values, I don't mean, and when I say life would be unbearable if we really eliminated all value, I don't mean to introduce value as a postulate. That's a very important methodological move. He doesn't mean to say life would be terrible without value, therefore we have to assume it and hold things together. Such an argument would do him no credit. And there's no merit to it, because maybe life is terrible, and then that has to be faced. So he is at great pains to say, I'm not introducing value as a postulate. I'm not saying let's act as if there's value so that life remains bearable to us. He says, I'm rather saying that it's easy to access, that it's already known to us in many places. That's the kind of analysis he makes. And look and see for yourself in how many places value is given. But he takes great care not to say that value has to be postulated. That is, that we have to act as if it were there in the world, to ward off the terrible consequences of a completely value-free world. So there's a lot there in those few pages in chapter 6. And it maybe serves as a chapter that helps us into the idea of the world of values. There's not just the category of value, but this vision of the world permeated with value that belongs also to his value philosophy.